A new book sheds light on St. Louis's key role in the Civil War. We'll have details next on City Corner. I'm Steve Potter, and welcome to City Corner. Peter Downs is a St. Louis writer who's come out with a new book, St. Louis Civil War Sites and the Fight for Freedom. Peter, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Steve.
It's good to have you here. So, are you a history major?
Well, I was, yes.
No, you really were?
Yeah, I really was.
You know, I think a lot of people, even if they live in this city, I mean, they know that St. Louis was here during the Civil War. But when I think of important Civil War sites, I don't know, I'm thinking of places like Georgia and like that. I have a feeling we have a lot more ties to the Civil War than the average person might realize.
Well, I think that's true. And that's part of the reason I wrote the book, is a lot happened here in the Civil War. And actually, St. Louis was kind of the reason, one of the main reasons the Civil War started. And I don't think people realize that.
Well, you better explain that right now.
All right. So, well, people have heard a lot about the Dred Scott case,
Right.
and we have a museum about it downtown. And the Dred Scott case really launched the career of Abraham Lincoln, for one, and a lot of the abolitionists seized on that because they viewed the Dred Scott case as kind of Southern overreach, if you will. It was the South taking control of the whole country and invalidating North laws and popular will in the North. So it became a very big flashpoint for the conflict that followed.
And St. Louis was sort of in an odd spot, isn't it? Being a slave state, but right across the river is a free state. That had to be an interesting juxtaposition.
Well, it was, but Southern Illinois was not extremely abolitionist. It was very much like St. Louis in their attitudes. So you had slaves would seek to cross the Mississippi to go to Illinois.
Because Alton had the Underground Railroad and all that.
As the first stop on the Underground Railroad. But also you had slave catchers and who would go over to Illinois to seize free African Americans and bring them to Missouri to be sold into slavery.
Your book, you say you go behind, this is your words, you go behind the monuments and historic sites to explore the people. Explain that.
Well, I think often history is boring for a lot of people. We go see a monument and we hear about the big ideas involved, but we don't learn anything about the people. And I think that connecting with the people who made history makes it more interesting. And when history is more interesting, is more entertaining, people pay more attention to it.
And one thing I think is really interesting about your book, and we'll show some examples of this coming up in a couple of minutes, is that you show a lot of these historic sites as they are today. So I'm just making this up. It's interesting to know that some important person's log cabin is where that gas station is now, you know?
Right, absolutely. And there are a lot of sites that didn't make it into the book, but certainly there are a lot of sites, you think of Ulysses S. Grant, and certainly we have Grant's cabin, but all the way down Gravois, there are sites where he would stop for lunch, where he would stop to buy bread to take home,
Wow. How do you document all this? I mean, where Ulysses S. Grant stopped for bread, I mean, you must have done a lot of research.
Yes, I did do a lot of research, and there are certainly a lot of newspaper articles from the 1900s and from the 1800s, late 1800s, that documented a lot of stuff as development removed sites that were connected with the Civil War, or removed sites connected to famous people associated with the Civil War. So they documented things then. As well, with some of these sites, and we talk about where people lived or worked, there were city directories from the mid-1800s in St. Louis. And I think that's not a heavily researched area, but that's one thing I consult a lot with to see, where people were at the time.
Your book is St. Louis Civil War Sites and the Fight for Freedom, and your book starts in the first chapter You describe a night in 1855 and a woman named Esther. That's how your book begins. What's that story?
So that's a story of a group of slaves, and Esther was one of them, who tried to escape to Illinois. And it was unusual at the time. Most escapes of enslaved people from Missouri were in ones and twos. And this was a group of 7 or 8 people. And it was sensational in St. Louis and received attention in Wisconsin and Ohio because it was labeled a slave stampede. You know, it was such a large group of enslaved people trying to escape that it got national attention. And now Esther was a slave of Henry Shaw, for whom we're indebted for Shaw's Garden. Mm-hmm. But he also had a mansion in the city. He had a home in the city as well as his summer home out where the garden is now. And she and her 2 sons were part of this group that tried to escape.
But
yes, so it turned out there was the sheriff of St. Louis and kind of slave catchers hired by Henry Shaw, who were waiting on the Illinois side of the river for them. And they fired some shots. They killed 1 person in the boat, captured Esther and her son, while a few others managed to escape.
we have an image to look at. I think it relates to the story you're just telling me. This is the Freedom Crossing mural. That's to do with Mary Meacham and the story you just told, right?
Yes. So that is a site, that is at the site that historians have pinpointed as to where Esther and the others tried to escape. And it's called the Mary Meacham Freedom Trail because Mary Meacham is thought to have organized that effort. We say thought, she wasn't there, but she was arrested a day or two later by the St. Louis sheriff and accused with being the person responsible for luring these slaves away from their masters.
Oh, because they didn't want to go.
No, that's right, because slaves love slavery so much, right? Enslaved people love slavery. That was the idea, is that they were lured away. So she was charged. She was ultimately acquitted because they couldn't provide any witnesses to place her at the site or any connection with it. The sheriff had claimed to have an informant that said she was responsible, but the informant was never produced for trial. And so she and 2 men arrested with her were acquitted of the charges.
Huh. I don't know if you can answer this, but of all the slaves that attempted to do that escape, did most of them make it? Did most of them not make it? Do we have any idea?
Historians say that only 40 to 50 enslaved people managed to escape a year from Missouri.
A year?
Yeah.
But
So that's not very many. And that, I'm trying to remember exactly the exact number because these are attempted to escapes, and I think only about 20% of them actually succeeded.
Let's look at another image from your book. This is of the 6th Street Jail. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so this was an infamous jail that is really central to the story of slavery in St. Louis. It sat at the corner of Chestnut and 6th Street. We have 2 empty storefronts at the corner now. I'd love to see one of them turned into a 6th Street Jail museum. Yeah. Because this is where Mary Meacham was taken when she was arrested. This is where enslaved people who sued for freedom, and we'll talk about some more of those later, they were often kept in jail during their lawsuit. And there was a teenage girl, later her maiden name was Lucy Delaney, but when she was 14, she sued for freedom because her mother was free. And she was kept there in jail for 15 months while her suit was being heard. There were others who were kept for 10, 12 years. It's a site where the sheriff would let Henry Choteau in to beat the slave who was suing him for freedom. So he'd let him in at night to beat him. There was a free African-American who worked on a riverboat who was arrested, put in the 6th Street Jail, and a crowd came and broke him loose in order to lynch him, and they burned him at the stake about a block from that jail. So it's really a site that gives context and information to the other sites around downtown that talk about enslaved people suing for freedom.
Can you describe accurately, do you think, what the atmosphere was like in the general population in those days? Missouri was a slave state. There were slaves here. Were there a lot of white people that were against slavery, or were the ones against it, did they kind of like keep that to themselves because they were afraid to talk publicly about it?
Well, you know, attitudes changed over the 40 years before the Civil War. So give an example. In 1820, the Missouri Supreme Court ruled that if a slave was taken to a free state, he or she became free. Even if brought back to Missouri, it didn't matter. They were free. By the late 1850s, the Missouri Supreme Court had reversed itself and said that no longer held. And that reflected, I think, a hardening of attitudes towards free African Americans and in support of slavery across Missouri during that time. So you had laws passed that said, black people couldn't worship in churches without a representative of the sheriff's office there to oversee them. Black people couldn't gather together in large numbers. Black people had to have a pass to walk about the city. And you had a whole series of those laws that really tightened the kind of the bounds of slavery in the state. In fact, in 1860, the Missouri legislature passed a law that would have enslaved any free African Americans living in Missouri. Now, the governor vetoed that law. Who knows what would have happened if the Civil War hadn't intervened the following year.
Right. Well, let's take a break. We've got a lot more to talk about, some more images from your book to share. Civil War, or St. Louis Civil War Sites is the name of the book, and we'll be back with more right after this.
Did you know dragging chains can spark a wildfire?
Only you can prevent wildfires.
Visitors and residents love the St. Louis Zoo because it's free. There's a train, a carousel, opportunities to make new friends, and plenty of fun learning experiences with the animals 363 days a year. So come and experience St. Louis.
When I was in foster care, I never knew when I would have to move. So I always had my suitcase ready to go. Then one day I was adopted. My new parents opened their hearts and home to me. My parents cook my favorite breakfast for me every morning. My parents take me on trips I never thought I would go on. They gave me a home and an even better reason to use that suitcase. My parents aren't perfect, but they're perfect for me.
What I love about St. Louis is the 79 unique neighborhoods nestled into 108 city parks, including Forest Park, which is actually larger than Central Park in New York, and of course, the beautiful Tower Grove Park where I'm at now. Oh, the St. Louis Blues. We've got the St. Louis Surge, two-time WBCBL champions. We've got Harris Stowe, WashU, St. Louis University, and of course, the 11-time World Series champion, St. Louis Cardinals. So come experience St. Louis.
I'm Steve Potter, and welcome back to City Corner. We're talking with Peter Downs about his new book, St. Louis Civil War Sites and the Fight for Freedom. And it's got a lot of pictures, as we said before, of not only historical pictures, but pictures of what certain places look like now with new buildings on them. And that's sort of the fascinating part of it. And did you discover anything in your research that surprised you, or did you kind of know it all?
I certainly didn't know. I think I discovered a lot of things that surprised me. One that I discovered early on in the research was just how active African Americans were in fighting slavery and in trying to win their own freedom.
You mean in the city?
In the city. So the story of Mary Meacham, Esther's attempt to escape, I mean, those are some examples. Another is, blacking on the name, I shouldn't do this. Yeah, but Moses is his name. He was a riverboat worker. He was a barber on a riverboat. And he had a meeting with other black riverboat workers at a house at Green and 7th, which is the site of the building that now holds the Blues Museum. Mm-hmm. And they organized, they met in order to organize a group based on riverboat workers. This is a picture from the levee in the 1850s. To organize a group for a slave rebellion across the South. So the members working on the riverboats, they would stop at places along their route and go out to meet with slaves who had managed to get out for the night or something, and drill in forces, attempt to organize a militia really to fight for freedom.
Let's look at the next image from your book.
Yeah, and so this is Memorial. Moses Dixon was the man's name. And he was involved in various movements after the Civil War as well, including thousands of freed African Americans from Mississippi who moved to Oklahoma to escape the terror of the Ku Klux Klan. And this is his memorial. It's in Shrewsbury. He had organized the cemetery there.
And the next image we have is the Federal Reserve Bank?
Yeah, so the Federal Reserve Bank is on the site of Bernard Lynch's slave pen. So that's the site where Esther was taken.
Oh.
After she was captured, when she tried to escape.
Did you call it a slave bin?
Slave pen, I'm sorry.
Slave
P-E-N.
pen.
Yeah, slave pen. And she was taken there, and the first floor was, a dirt-floored room, men and women, all kept chained in there with a little window for light. And she was kept there for months until sold to a slave owner in Tennessee, in Mississippi, Vicksburg.
Our next image, and tell me about this, it's the Freedom Lawsuit Monument.
Yeah, it's a brand new monument in St. Louis. It was erected this summer outside the Civil Courts building, and this is a monument to the hundreds of enslaved people who filed suits for freedom in Missouri.
Yeah, I find the whole Illinois, like we were talking about before, Missouri thing so interesting. You were talking about how people felt about slavery, and there are mixed feelings. And the whole Elijah Lovejoy story to me is fascinating. Maybe correct me if I make any mistakes, but he owned a newspaper in St. Louis, and he was against slavery and would publish editorials about that. And I guess push came to shove eventually, and he had to get out of the city, right? So he moved it to Alton, where the same thing happened, and it ended up he was killed by an angry mob who threw his printing press into the river because he was against slavery.
Right, and that when you ask things that surprise me, one thing that surprised me is the same people keep coming up in different parts of the story. So Elijah Lovejoy, as you said, what got him in trouble was the 6th Street Jail. It was when Francis McIntosh was taken from the 6th Street Jail and lynched. Elijah Lovejoy editorialized against that lynching. So a hearing was held on whether any laws were broken, and the judge, ironically named Luke Lawless, steered the hearing to say the only laws that were broken by Elijah Lovejoy, and that in his reporting on this, and he basically incited a riot. He incited a mob to go down and sack Elijah Lovejoy's building and throw the printing press in the river. After that, he decided to move to Alton.
Because it was a free state, supposedly.
Because it was a free state. In Alton, and as you indicated, he was his press was attacked again. He and friends tried to defend it, and he was shot and killed, and his building was burned. And the mayor of Alton, who was part of the mob that attacked the press, a man named John Crum, then left Alton and came to St. Louis, where he became a judge. And he was the first judge to hear the suits by Dred Scott and his wife for freedom.
That seems kind of crazy.
You know, and Dred Scott's attorney in that suit, this guy named Francis Murdoch, he was the district attorney in Alton at the time when Elijah Lovejoy was killed. And so he first brought criminal cases against Elijah Lovejoy's companions, saying that their defense of the printing press is what caused the riot. They all got off. So he then brought lawsuit against the mob, criminal charges against the mob that attacked the printing press. But they all got off because the mob included the judge in that case and the mayor and several other prominent people.
So seems like things haven't changed that much.
That's right. So after that, he left and came to St. Louis, where he became the most prominent lawyer representing enslaved people suing for freedom in the 1840s.
That's interesting. There are a lot of remnants of the Underground Railroad in Alton. It's fascinating to kind of look back on. Let's look at another image from your book, and this is Shoto's Pond. How does that fit into the story?
So Shoto's Pond, and this is taken from about where 8th and Clark Street is now. Shoto's Pond was many things, but one of the things it was the site where African Baptists would baptize their members. And so
did slaves, they were allowed to have their own churches and things?
They were. The first African church in St. Louis was set up in the 1820s, and then moved to, it was set up by Mary Meacham and her husband. And it moved to a site that is now underneath the site where the Tums factory is. But after about, I'd say 15, 20 years, the state passed a law that said Africans couldn't meet in churches to worship unless there was a representative of the sheriff's office there to oversee what was said.
Wow. Interesting. The next shot, we've got a couple together. This is the Mercantile Library, and then something that's related to that.
So the Mercantile Library really is a crucial site in St. Louis Civil War history. First, there was a state convention there to decide whether or not Missouri should secede from the Union. And Missouri is the only state that elected delegates to a convention on secession where they voted against seceding from the Union. And then at the end of the war, there's another convention there that voted to abolish slavery in Missouri. So it kind of bracketed the Civil War with two very important decisions.
I think there's another image here.
Yeah, so this is the building currently on the site of the old historic Mercantile Library, and it's served as a Mercantile Library for a time, but is now being turned into luxury apartments.
I know that you and your wife live in Soulard and have for some time. That must be the perfect place for someone that's obsessed with history to live, right?
Oh, it's a great place, and I don't know if you'll get to it, but we have a picture of Soulard Market.
That's coming up next, so we can show that. Go ahead and talk about it.
So the Soulard Market is ended up being the headquarters for one of the German militias that was against secession. You had both.
Wasn't it sort of like a social gathering spot?
It was a market, a social gathering spot.
Yeah.
It became the armory for one of the militias. You had both pro and anti-slavery militias in St. Louis before the Civil War began. You had some immigrants from Hungary, actually. Robert and Roderick Rombauer started the first militia there in Soulard because they participated in the failed revolution in Hungary in 1848, and they were looking at the pro-slavery interests setting up militias and said, we need something on our side. And so they recruited people to go through every block of Soulard to recruit men willing to come out at a moment's notice to fight to keep Missouri in the Union and fight against slavery.
Wow. Do you have an answer for this? I'm just curious. My mother's side of the family were German immigrants before the Civil War, and I know St. Louis had a lot of Irish immigrants and a few other groups. Did those immigrants from other countries take a particular stand on slavery? They weren't from here. Are you able to even comment on that? Do you know?
Well, I think that the Germans immigrants were the ones renowned for being against slavery. And I said, German does not mean Germany. You know, basically, any peoples who spoke a German language. And so,
Right.
a lot of Central European countries today would fall in that category, as well as the Dutch. And they were heavily discriminated against in St. Louis by the slaveholding classes, the French and English. The story in the book about how the kind of the high class ladies tended to refer to the Germans as Amsterdam Dutch without the Amster.
My grandmother was born in 1891, used to tell me those stories, how, they were business owners and things, but they were looked down upon because they were German. And I kind of got the impression then the Germans looked down on the Irish, and it was sort of...
Yeah, so the pro-union militias in St. Louis were overwhelmingly German, kind of like 80-90% German. The Bohemians were considered a different group, but they were there in force. And then there were some efforts to attract the Irish, but a lot of prominent Irish leaders were very pro-slavery. One of them was Father Bannon at St. John the Apostle and Evangelist Church, who he actually left the church in order to join the Confederate Army.
Wow, this has been only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to everything that's in your book. How do we get a copy of it?
Well, it's available at a lot of local bookstores. And you can contact Arcadia Publishing and order directly online from Arcadia Publishing or from Amazon.com.
Peter Downs has been our guest. St. Louis Civil War Sites and the Fight for Freedom is the book. And in conclusion, is there one thing about the Civil War that we should never forget?
That's a really tough question. But I think one of the things that came out to me in this research is that the Civil War was not one thing, right? I think in primary school and stuff we all learn Civil War was about slavery. It was about many things, really. And here in St. Louis, it was about slavery. It was also about democracy. It was about aristocracy. It was really kind of a revolution against French slaveholders and their Virginia allies kind of ruling St. Louis and making a more democratic St. Louis.
Well, St. Louis Civil War Sites and the Fight for Freedom, Peter Downs, thank you for joining us today.
It's been my pleasure.
I guess it's a topic that we'll never stop being interested in, really, right?
I hope not. A lot of fascinating stories there.
Thank you, Peter. I'm Steve Potter, and thank you for joining us on this edition of City Corner. We'll see you next time.